Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Tactical Health Podcast. I'm Mike Phillip, and I'm here with Dr. Peter Glidden.
Good morning, Mike.
Good morning. So I sent you an email the other day on a story that I posted on my website, americanuckradio.com, and it's a story that we covered on our show, but this actually carries over into what we do over here at Tactical Health, exposing medical myths, lies, and downright dangerous practices of the current North American allopathic reductionist medical model. And
Mike, you're starting to sound like me.
Yeah, well, I mean, you make a lot of sense, right? So why not? Emulation is the most sincere form of flattery, they say.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So MKUltra, a lot of people have heard of that. Not everybody. It used to be something that if you brought up MKUltra at all, it was akin to believing in Sasquatches and interdimensional portals, tinfoil hat, black helicopter, all that. But this is something that actually happened. And it started in the 50s and it carried on till the 70s unofficially. So this went on for over 20 years. Okay? Now, what's happened recently, and the reason that we're bringing this up is because the Canadian government has been forced to compensate victims and their relatives of the MKUltra experiments. Now, these experiments officially ended around the time that I was born. And so there are people alive today who were involved. I think we have a video clip from Canada's state news agency, CBC. Dr. Glidden?
Let's run it.
Let's run it.
The Korean War ended, the CIA saw a troubling pattern, returning prisoners of war critical of the American way of life.
Now you just sit there quietly and cooperate.
Movies like The Manchurian Candidate stoked fears of a new communist weapon, brainwashing. The CIA wanted to understand more about brainwashing. It had money and it was ready to fund experiments. And that's what led it here to the Allen Memorial Institute.
Okay, can you pause that?
One of the most prestigious.
All right, so the CIA was worried about returning veterans being influenced by communist brainwashing. First of all, I'd like to point out, now we know what happened to Senator John McCain.
He is the Manchurian Candidate.
He's the one, yeah. There's no more traitorous politician in Washington, arguably, than Senator John McCain. But here's the thing. We're told that we need a government and we need a military in order to protect us from a foreign nation or intelligence service or army that would want to do harm to us, torture us, experiment on us medically. You remember the Nuremburg trials. Obviously, the Nazis conducted a bunch of medical experiments that were unethical and highly illegal. So then we're told that our government, in conjunction with a foreign intelligence service, decided that in order to understand this better, they decided to do it to a bunch of Canadian citizens.
Yeah, so it's the same thing over and over again, right? You can justify your behavior based on national security needs, right? It's just nonsense, right? So what you're telling me is that the Central Intelligence Agency got together with the Canadian government. They rounded up a bunch of Canadian citizens. They gave them LSD. They gave them electroshock therapy in order to figure out, the best way to brainwash somebody and then what to do to maybe unbrainwash them, because you couldn't know how to unbrainwash someone unless you figured out how to brainwash them in the first place. And all of this was a covert operation. It was, classified. It didn't really exist. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And now all of a sudden it's come out.
It's come out. Let's go on with this video and get some reactions from some of the victims and how the Canadian government has handled it.
Psychiatric hospitals in Canada and its director, Dr. Ewan Cameron.
These are the days and hours are the occasion.
Cameron's patients, many of them women with postpartum depression, became guinea pigs in an experiment called de-patterning, breaking down the mind with repeat.
Many of the people, the patients, women with postpartum depression. Okay? So, number one, you're taking an extremely vulnerable segment of society. Right?
Right.
And they're not telling them exactly. Think about it. If you sat down with somebody and said, okay, look, I'm going to shock your brain and give you hallucinogenic drugs that you've never had before, and you won't know it when we do, but this is going to help you, so sign here. They would not have signed there. Okay?
Well, they couldn't even say that this is going to help you. You know, what they should have said is, this is a big experiment, and we're going to give you mind-altering hallucinogenic drugs. We have no idea how they act on the body. We have no idea what the primary effects. We have no idea what the side effects are. We basically need to use you as a human guinea pig. And in the meantime, we're going to do high voltage to your brain. We have no idea what that's going to do either, but we just like to figure it out. And would you like to sign on the dotted line? Nobody would do that. I don't care how depressed you are. You just wouldn't do that.
No, you wouldn't. And so they hid it. There was no consent involved. Not only that, but even if they did lie about it and get a signature in the form of a non-disclosure agreement or some form of consent in the way of that signature, I'd like to point out that under contract law, the signature of a contract needs to understand the terms. Otherwise, that contract is null and void. I can't go to a 4-year-old and say, sign this paper or make an X on this line, and that means that I have to give you candy. Well, of course, the toddler is going to sign that because they want the candy. And then immediately after they do, I turn around and say, well, it says down here, you got to play in traffic. You signed it. Okay, that doesn't work. Okay, that's unlawful.
And
that's
I'd also like to point out that it wasn't the naturopaths that were doing this. It wasn't the herbalists that were doing this. It wasn't the chiropractors that were doing this. It wasn't the homeopaths that were doing this. It wasn't the acupuncturists, the Ayurvedic medical practitioners, or the traditional Chinese medical doctors that were doing it. Who was it?
The MDs.
Right? And nobody goes to jail. You want to see more of the clip?
Yeah, let's keep her going. We'll run it to the end here.
Shocks and drugs, including massive doses of LSD.
He took my mother away from me.
Allison Steele was 4 when her mother Jean fell into a depression.
And we have pictures of her skiing, horseback riding, always a smile, happy, a person that I didn't know. I never saw my mother this way.
60 years after her mother's treatment, Allison Steele finally has her medical records.
This is where I got to know my mother. What happened to her, the horror that she went through. Pacing the hall this morning, saying, I'm just a prisoner. I feel like Jesus on the cross, can feel the nails in my hands and feet.
Here's the LSD.
It's just like being buried alive. Somebody, please do something.
Jean Steele was kept in a drug-induced coma for weeks, her brain repeatedly shocked. Dr. Cameron broke her down, but wasn't able to put her back together.
So I just learned over time to not talk to her because I knew she couldn't. So that made me angry.
In the 90s, the Government of Canada, which also funded Cameron's experiments, compensated several dozen patients, but only those who had been completely depatterned.
Pause it. Okay, so in the 90s, they compensated a bunch of people, but only if you were a puddle of gibbering jello that couldn't tie your shoelaces. That was, okay, that's obvious damage. But this goes on to say that the rest they did not, because the damage was not considered significant. Even though they lost their life, this woman's 4-year-old daughter had no idea who her mother was.
Now, this is all very interesting because after World War II, when the world got wind of what the Nazis were doing behind the scenes with the death camps, at the Nuremburg trials, right, they became so horrified about what had happened behind the scenes that they generated something called the Nuremberg Code for Human Rights, which all nations in the world are legally bound to abide by. Let me read you some of the finer points of the Nuremberg Code. So this concerns experimentation, medical experimentation. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice, without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the test involved. The experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society. The experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease in order to justify the experiment. The experiment should be conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. And those are just 3 of the 10 points of the Nuremberg Code, all of which were violated by the MKUltra experiments.
Every single one.
Hundreds of people, not only Canadian citizens, but U.S. citizens as well.
For 20 years.
It's good to be the king, right? And this is the society that we live in. This is the situation that we live in, Mike. And, you know, if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times, that the problem with medicine in the modern day and age is that we don't have a free medical market. We haven't had a free medical market for the longest time now. And lack of a free medical market is what gives rise to all of this nonsense. So all of these unbelievably horrifying experiments, horrifying experiments are able to be taken place, and it's the medical society that promotes them. It's the government that does it. Nobody goes to jail. Nobody's hands get slapped. You give the victims $100,000, but those are only the ones that completely lost their mind. Meanwhile, wasn't somebody, a Canadian citizen who was tortured in Syria, just awarded millions? What was the deal with that?
Okay, so we had Omar Khadr, who was a Canadian teenager, and they went over to Afghanistan, him and his father. And the story is that in combat, he threw a grenade that killed a U.S. Army medic, Chris Spears, and was sent to Guantanamo Bay, where he suffered torture. And this is the story that we're given. But it was decided that the Canadian government would give him $10.5 million for passing along information to U.S. authorities, which resulted in his abuse of human rights. Now, there were also 3 men recently who traveled to Syria from Canada, and while they were there, it is said that they were taken in by the Assad regime arrested and tortured. It has now come out that they were all awarded $10.5 million each. That's the going rate, $10.5 million. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, interestingly enough, came out and said that when Canadians' rights are violated, Canadians need to pay. And I think we should pay attention to that wording there because, interestingly enough, these payouts to the MKUltra victims, which incidentally, they only got $100,000. Okay? And these are old stock Canadians. $100,000 as compared to somebody who moved here from Syria and became a Canadian, went back to their home country and was tortured. Then you get $10.5 million. An old stock Canadian, you get messed with by your government in contravention of the Nuremberg Code and Canadian law, you get $100,000.
And, you know, nobody goes to jail. I mean, aren't they
goes to jail.
Aren't they still trying to track down people who were, you know, the guards at Auschwitz? Now they're 95 years old, and they're trying to track those people down and throw them in jail or do something to them, right?
Well, yeah, you hear about it all the time. They'll get some guy that's like 98, and apparently he was some low-level guard at Auschwitz, and we've got to make a big show trial of this person. Yeah, absolutely. And I got to think that, listen, if this went on until 1973, unofficially, that there are people alive today who, whether or not they had an active role in these experiments or were a guard, knowing that there was people being tortured, then the same principle should apply, I would think. But no, Canadians, people that pay taxes, have to pay for what the government did.
It's crazy. It's 100% inside out, upside down, backwards, and yet here we are. It's the same thing all over again. It's just a different color of the crazy spectrum. But yet again, right, the conventional medical industry is implicated here. They're a major player in all of this. I can't emphasize this enough. When you hear about nasty human rights violations and medical experimentation and just really bad stuff, it's never members of the quote-unquote alternative medical industry that are involved. It's never that. It's always the MDs. 100% of the time, it's the MDs. And nobody pays any attention to that. Nobody says, well, son of a gun, it's the MDs, 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 it's the MDs. Maybe we should take a look at that medical profession. Maybe we should clip their wings a little bit. I mean, when one member who has some secondary or tertiary relationship with ISIS does something crazy, we blame ISIS, and rightly so. But when the medical doctors do it, nobody blames their profession. They get away scot-free. And this, again, is, I think, an indication of how deeply socialized we have all become. I mean, maybe they've put LSD in our water. I don't know.
Well, and people can say, well, this is 40 some odd years ago, MKUltra, so we don't do that anymore. Bullshit. Yeah, we do. Not we, they do. I mean, how many people have called your show when you were back doing your radio show that were put on methotrexate for bone and joint pain? I mean, they're repackaging drugs all the time, renaming and repurposing them and giving them to people for different, AIDS drugs. AZT was a failed chemotherapy drug that has a black box warning that says causes death in 5 years, a total DNA chain disruptor, and they just turn around and give it to people.
Yeah,
so,
they're putting psychotropic meds in pain medication now.
Yeah, right. And, you can think of a million examples. Look at the opioid crisis. They know that these synthetic opioids are killing people. I know a first responder on a large fire department in the USA. They had to have training to mask up and basically put on a hazmat suit just to be near these opioids, because some of them are so dangerous that a grain of sand worth will kill you if it gets into your lungs. And this was all unleashed on the public by the medical system.
Yeah, the conventional medical system, but with the pharmaceutical industry. A lot of people don't know it, but the German pharmaceutical companies in World War II banded together and they owned a concentration camp.
Well, they were brought over here under Operation Paperclip. So, the Allies burned a bunch of low-level security guards at different camps and whatnot. But the guys who were doing the real medical experimentation, if you look at the history of Bayer Pharmaceuticals, a lot of them were divvied up between the Allied nations and brought over to the United States under Operation Paperclip. So a lot of the people that committed the biggest atrocities were given well-paid jobs and houses in the United States. So, it's the same thing. Eric Margolis wrote an article about the Soviet Union and the fall of it in the New York Times, where he said that Mikhail Gorbachev directly came to the Politburo and said, gentlemen, you're going to hear that the Soviet Union has fallen. It's not true. We're just merging with the West, to wild applause. Mikhail Gorbachev presently resides at the Presidio in San Francisco to this day. So, all these horrible, horrible systems that we're told we went to war with to stop what they were doing. Why? Well, because they experiment on their people and they lock people up for no reason and they do this and they do that. It was the same thing here with the Nazis. It was the same thing with the Soviet Union. I'm not saying that we are 100% as bad as the Nazi regime, but there are parallels. Now, what can you do about this? What can you do to avoid being experimented on like a guinea pig, butchered like a hog, and treated like a bucket of chemicals and water? What would be a better way to go, Dr. Glidden?
Well, so, we need a free medical market but that's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. It might happen within 100 years, but it's going to be a slow drip that fills up that pond. So rather than wait for the governments of the world to all get together and say, you know what, we really do need to let all these alternative practitioners into the game. We need to have equal access for everybody and equal amounts of research money for everybody. And we need to build naturopathic hospitals and we need to build homeopathic hospitals. That's not going to happen in our lifetime. It's necessary. So what people need to do in the meantime, while we're waiting for a utopia that maybe your great-great-great-grandchildren will be able to take advantage of and enjoy, you need to educate yourself about what you can do right now on your own in order to extract yourself from the medical mousetrap of conventional medicine and make your body healthy. Because your body has a remarkable ability to fix itself. Your body's ability to fix itself is so much greater than anybody has led you to believe. And I can tell you that after 29 years of primary care medical practice as a licensed naturopathic physician, that most of the things that most people go to the doctor for, most of the time, they don't need to go to the doctor for. They can sort those things out themselves with a little bit of education. If you're suffering with high blood pressure, you're suffering with fibromyalgia, you're suffering with infertility, you're suffering with anxiety and insomnia and type 2 diabetes, blood sugar issues, whatever it is, the first thing you need to do is figure out what nutrients to give your body to support and promote your body's built-in God-given ability to fix itself, and what foods to stop eating, because there are certain foods that are going to hurt your body. But you need, and it's simple stuff. This is not rocket science. If you're smart enough to be able to know how to load a bullet into a gun and fire it accurately, if you're smart enough to know how to pass the driver's license test, then you're smart enough to know, to learn, to understand the simple steps necessary to get your body into the game of healing. And that's the reason that I exist on planet Earth right now. We're building a grassroots coalition of the informed by disseminating science-based, clinically verified information that everybody and their brother can use in order to just get your body into the game of healing. It's not that difficult. So go to tacticalhealth.org, tacticalhealth.org, click through on the banner ad to become a subscriber at glidden.healthcare, and avail yourself of this information. Because if you don't take steps right now in order to get your body into the game of healing, it's only a matter of time until something in your body breaks, and then you're going to have to go to the medical mousetrap. The MDs are going to offer you therapeutics, the intention of which is not to cure your illness, but simply to manage it. And then you're going to go from the frying pan into the fire. And, from that point until the time that you die, it's going to be one medical disaster after the next. You need to avoid those pitfalls on the road of life, and it's a million times easier than you think it is.
Don't be an experiment.
Exactly. Don't be an experiment. I am your steadfast advocate for health, Dr. Peter Glidden. It's always a pleasure hanging out with you, Mike. We'll see you next time.
See you next time, Doc.